Okay, well, I'm really honored to be here. When Kevin and Alicia emailed me, I'm like, what do I have to say? And as it turns out, I think I might have done the first dissertation, is that what it is? On Filipino American identity, which really, it really makes me feel old. So thank you all. Okay, so I have my PowerPoint. I can't even actually see it. Huh. And I always start with a picture of my grandparents, but I couldn't find a picture of my grandparents. So I'll start with a picture of my mother and her best friend. I am 2.5, I say I'm 2.5 generation Filipino because my mother was born and raised in Hawaii. And my dad's from the Philippines. He came here as a student in the 50s, but my mother was born and raised. And these are really terrible pictures. I'm kind of untech savvy. But that's my mom on the right, and that's her best friend, who's we would say here in California, Japanese American, but in Hawaii, you would say she's local Japanese. And this has some, as you'll see, it has something to do with how I started studying identity, because my mother didn't grow up on the plantation. Her grandma, my grandma worked on the plant. My grandparents kind of worked on the plantations, but then she was like a townie. And most of her friends were not Filipino. She can speak Ilocano if she has to, but she doesn't. She really doesn't. And my dad's from Pangasinan, and so he can't speak Ilocano. So we were raised speaking English. Okay, next slide. So I grew up in Southern California, and then my dad got a job with the Army Corps of Engineers. So she's a nurse, and he's an engineer. Does that sound familiar? But I grew up first in Southern California, and then we started moving when I was 12. So I ended up going to 3 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and a different high school every year. My last high school was an Army school in Japan. And so I don't know anyone except military people who have kind of a similar background. And two of the places I lived were Florida and Maryland. And I went from being, I grew up in Carson, California, which is fairly diverse, to being we were the only Filipinos within a whatever radius, right? Our family. Luckily, we had there was 7 of us ultimately. But we were really the only Filipinos where we were and in school. And that's why I really enjoy the TV show Fresh Off the Boat, because I can relate to a lot of that. My kids don't like it. They're like, oh, we don't know what he's talking about. But I really can't, even though I think he's a decade younger than me. So I landed at UCSD for college, and I was involved in the Asian American, somewhat involved, not really a leader, but involved in the Asian American Student Association. My roommates and a lot of my friends were Chicano and Mexicano, so I did actually a lot with Mecha back then. I was a summer bridge counselor, so that's me. And these are like my students. So he was Mexipino, he was Chicano, Filipino, Chicano. I don't think she might have been Filipino, Vietnamese, and Blasian, I guess you call it now. There was no Asian American Studies. There was Third World Studies. I took an African American Studies class, and my professor did not get tenure. I think I might have taken the first, they ended up having one Asian American Studies class that was taught by a white graduate student in anthropology. And I think they had to import him from somewhere else. He didn't even go to UCSD. So guess what my final paper was on? Identity, of course, right? And I probably still have it, because I'm a hoarder. But I probably still have that paper talking about my identity. And there's a lot of Filipinos in San Diego, right? Anybody besides Dr. Judy Pataxel from San Diego? Anybody else? Yeah. But I didn't grow up there. And so people were questioning my identity. Like, well, how can you relate to Filipinos from the South Bay? I'm like, really? They didn't have a problem with me. But okay, next slide. I ended up, when I was at UCSD, this picture cracks me up. I went to a Halarama conference in UC Davis, and I was in this group called Students Active Towards Community Health, and everybody was either Filipino or Chicano at the time, and I don't even know if that group exists. But we were very active. We had all kinds of great things going on at UCSD, even though there was no Asian American Studies. Okay, next slide. And then I went to UCLA, which was my dream school. Who's from UCLA? Thank you, yay, born to be a Bruin. It actually had more to do with basketball back then than anything else. But I got into UCLA to grad school. And this is a picture from 2013, and every year they take a picture of the entering graduate student class. So there's a picture of me in the 80s, similar to this. So it just cracked me up that they're still doing this picture in front of this, on the steps at Franz Hall. And back then, there were 2 Asian American professors in the psychology department. I'm actually not a clinician. I have my PhD in developmental psychology from UCLA. And Charles Nakamura was there, and then Stanley Hsu got wooed away from University of Washington. So he moved his whole lab down to UCLA. But I didn't know that. I was in development, or I didn't, that wasn't anything to me. I was in developmental psychology. I thought I was going to go into cognitive development. I think you don't do a thesis when you're over there, so you kind of get your master's along the way. And I think that my master's project was something to do with cognitive development. But then I ended up, being a pawn in the department, as many of you may have experienced, and I had a change of advisor, and I ended up working with Amado Padilla. So I don't know if you know who he is, but he was really a pioneer in a lot of multicultural education, bilingual education kind of studies. So Amado really encouraged me, to explore some ethnic psychology things. There was an Asian American Studies, I believe it was a center at the time with all kinds of really cool people, but there was a lot of upheaval then too. Back then, Don Nakanishi, who was, everybody's a pioneer back in the 80s, right, in the field. Don Nakanishi was really a pioneer in like kind of education things, and he wasn't getting tenure. It was just this whole ugly tenure battle, which really made me think, what am I doing? Why would I go into this ethnic psychology when I'm not going to be able to get a job? And if I get a job, I'm not going to be able to get tenure. So it's the harsh realities. But anyway, Amado ended up going to Stanford, and unbeknownst to me, they made Stan Hsu my dissertation chair. So Stan was on my dissertation committee, and like really behind my back. They said, well, Amado, since you're going to Stanford, you can't be on her dissertation. He's like, well, I can fly back down to help her, but they wouldn't let him. So Stan ended up being my chair, which was the greatest thing ever. I mean, these are 2 really, really great men. But when I was exploring, both of them encouraged me to really follow my heart. And I found this dissertation written by Christine Ejima Hall. Anyone know her? Know her work? Yeah, I think she did the very first dissertation on multiracial identity, and I was so relieved, I think, to find that dissertation, and I kind of, that was my inspiration. Okay, next slide. Oh, this isn't me, but I like this picture because it kind of captures what it was like back then. This is you're going to see the Delano Monong's film, but this is taken at Agbayani Village, and the Politos are in there, Mark and Marissa Polito, who are my God brothers and sisters. And I just love it because it kind of captures what it was like back in those days, pilgrimage up to Agbayani Village from UCLA. One of the greatest moments of my life was meeting Philip Veracruz. So, okay, next slide. So this is my dissertation. It's a couple of things you notice. So down in LA, they're Filipino Americans, right? I had to be converted. I have 5 minutes? Okay, I had to be converted from being Filipino American to Filipino American. And I became a Filipino American again once I moved to Seattle. But back in LA, I was a Filipino American. It's 1989. This was written on a dot matrix printer. Okay, next slide. There's my abstract. Next slide. And it says, well, what did I find? Persons, I studied what were the variables that made one identify as Filipino American or not, have a strong ethnic identity. Next slide. And there's my model. Here's my background variables, ethnic identity, outcomes, college experiences. I was really interested in whether or not your involvement in Filipino student activities and they had Asian American Studies classes there, affected your ethnic identity. Next slide. And this was, my N was 231, and here's the last page. Indicate with an X how each person identifies themselves. Filipino, Filipino American, Asian American, American Filipino descent. I mean, it's a little embarrassing now, but that's okay. This talk forced me to find my dissertation and read the abstract anyway. Finally, how has the current political situation in the Philippines affected your identity or outlook on being Filipino? What was happening in the 80s? Right? And then, what does it mean to you to be a Filipino student at UCLA? Okay, next slide. And look at how many people had to be on my committee. 6 people, because Dwayne, Wendell, and Stan Sue were psychologists in the psychology department, so I had to have 3 people, I think, from the department. Harry Kitano, Valerie Matsumoto, and Don Nakanishi were in Asian American Studies. In order to have them, I had to have 3 psychologists. And have you ever seen a committee that big? That's 6 people you have to please, right? And actually, it wasn't that bad, but still, it was a lot. One of my friends said he looked at my dissertation in the library at UCLA, and there's all kinds of really snarky comments. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then I got a job, and I became an assistant professor in American Ethnic Studies at University of Washington. And that's where I met the Cordovas. And this was life-changing. It really was. If any of you have ever met Fred and Dorothy Cordova, I became a member of the Filipino American National Historical Society. Who's a member? Yay! And Judy is the vice president. And it really, because this was an old community that was very active. They're both second generation. Well, he's passed away now, but they're second generation, and they had this very strong sense of being Filipino and preserving Filipino American studies for the children's sake. Dorothy describes herself as being a professional Filipino, kind of, and I kind of adopted that. I mean, it's kind of like spreading the word on Filipino American identity. Okay, next slide. And then I moved to Hawaii. I got married. I moved to Hawaii. And this is what I found. Now, remember, I'd grown up kind of going to Hawaii because my mom's from there. This is by Corky Trinidad. And what we find in Hawaii, and who's from Hawaii? Yeah. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we find a lot of Filipinos who deny that they're Filipino because of the way Filipinos are portrayed in the media. Everybody thinks Hawaii is this racial paradise, but it's not. It really is not. And ask any Pacific Islander, ask a native Hawaiian. It isn't. And there's kind of like the haoles up on the top, and then the local Japanese and the local Chinese. The Filipinos are down here, and then the Polynesians are down here. And so we had this cartoon. Now, he made this cartoon, I think in I don't know what it was. I think it was for the 75th anniversary of Filipinos in Hawaii. Next slide. And then he updated it for, I think it was 85th or 95th or 100th anniversary, because it's still relevant. It still happens in Hawaii that there is this denial of being Filipino because kids are ashamed. Kids are ashamed of being Filipino. So I was writing a lot on that. Okay, next slide. And then I got involved. At the time, I was I think I had been on the board of the Association for Asian American Studies, and I was still very involved. And this is back in 1998. We had this conference in Hawaii, and the Asian American Studies Board gave a literature award to Lois Ann Yamanaka. This is a very famous controversy about this book. And what a lot of people don't know is previously, at another earlier conference, they had given her an award for her first book of poetry. And there was this poem that's really, really, very stereotypical, Filipinos as sexual deviants kind of thing. So we'd gone through this earlier, like 3 years before. Then they were going to give this next award to her again. And a bunch of us, raised this controversy. It was kind of painful to look at it again. But I was involved in that. And just did a lot more writing on identity, Filipino identity in Hawaii. Next slide. The other thing I did, which is much more positive, is because I could write, I was the humanities scholar on this great film, Untold Triumph, about the 1st and 2nd Filipino American regiments of World War II, narrated by Lou Diamond Phillips. I'm still bitter that I never got to meet him. But But it was, you know, it went a long way in Hawaii. It did, and it was aired on national PBS. Okay, next slide. Now I'm in Sacramento, and one of the things Kevin thought that I could talk about is one of the things I see as issues for the Filipino American community. I run all the community-based programs at this nonprofit, and I work with a lot of seniors, and her mother has dementia, so that's a big thing. As we age, you know, learning to deal with aging and dementia. And in the Filipino American community, there is such denial about dementia, caregiving, how to age healthily, what are the resources. There's an Alzheimer's Association that they will never call. They will never call. So that's what I'm trying to bridge those gaps. Okay, next slide. And because I started with my mother, I have to kind of have a picture with my dad. And this is Ping Sarafica. Anybody know who she is? Yeah. So Ping, she's in her 80s. They were actually classmates in the Philippines. She's a professor at Ohio State. She's a developmental psychologist. So she's really a pioneer too. And so I wanted to put a picture of Ping. Okay, next slide. And then this is, I've only been to the Philippines twice, once when I was in the 80s, and then 30 years later, a couple of years ago with my family, my niece and nephew, my parents, that's at Banawe, to instill in my kids a strong Filipino American identity. Their dad's Chinese, and he's got a large extended family here in the Bay Area, so they're always doing these Chinese things and not doing too many Filipino things. You know, I drag them to FONS meetings, and that's kind of it. We do some cultural things in Sacramento, but it's really kind of difficult. Next slide. See, there they are. They're mixed in this picture at FONS, at the FONS conference in San Diego. And then last slide. And I took my daughter to Seattle, and there's this great exhibit on I Am Filipino at the Wing Luke Museum. So that's it.